Before we begin, I first want to acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. So welcome, I'm Sarah Chambers, Chair of the History Department, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this month's edition of the History Book Club of the Air. We've had a little bit of snow here on the Twin Cities campus, but now the sun has come out. We are featuring books every month of current and past faculty, as well as alumni of our history program. And the format, for those of you who may be tuning in for the first time, is that we'll start out with our speaker providing a little bit of background and context on our book for today. Then we'll have a discussion about the book between the two speakers. And then towards the end, in the last 15 or 20 minutes or so, there'll be an opportunity for those of you in the audience to put a question into the chat, and I will read those questions and we'll have those answered on the Zoom. Meanwhile, I want to thank Clayton Smith, our development officer, who sets these up and will be monitoring things in the background. They've been going very smoothly, but should anything happen, he's keeping an eye on things. So today, it's a great pleasure to welcome back a PhD alum from 2008, Pritipuspa Mishra, to talk about her 2020 book, Language and the Making of Modern India, Nationalism and the Vernacular in Colonial Odisha, 1803 to 1956. And it's, for me, an interesting book because even though I'm a complete outsider to this field of history, it shows the importance of history because she is looking at the ways in which the way history got written at different points in time and at different places within India would shape discussions about the nation and its independence and what it meant to be a citizen of India. So I'm excited to hear more about how she came to that project, where she's taking it these days, and to the conversation that she'll have with Professor Ajay Skaria of our department, who was also her dissertation advisor. So with that, I will turn things over to Priti and we'll get started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I wanted to start with thanking Clayton for managing all of this and for asking me to come speak here last year in the middle of pandemic madness, and Sarah and Ajay for really making this work right now. It's great to be back at Minnesota. I haven't really been back since I left, so it's a quite nice homecoming. Thank you. I wanted to kind of talk a little bit. I mean, obviously, when Ajay and I talk, we'll talk about the details of the book. But what I wanted to do was to talk about how it has come about over the last kind of 10 years. In the making of this book, the book traveled across the world with me. It started in Minnesota and it ended up in the UK. It began as a dissertation, and through the number of many moves, it became something very different from where it began. So what I wanted to talk about are two kind of provocations that helped me change the shape of the book from the dissertation, which was an entirely different question, to what it has today become. So the first provocation, for that to make sense, I should talk a little bit about what the original project was. So originally the dissertation was seeking to kind of explore the making of region as a category in Indian nationalist thought. Now, this is a really, this is a preoccupation in South Asian historiography, and quite a lively preoccupation. There are a lot of people who are trying to think through what is the region and when does it begin becoming a concept? Is it a kind of pre-colonial thing? Are these regions like Orissa, Bengal, Tamil Nadu, etc., kind of much more kind of long-term things than we see them as, or are they kind of products of colonialism and products of colonial power relations with local elites? And the reason for this kind of preoccupation is that regional politics, regional language, regional identity both kind of interrupt and constitute the Indian nation in very, very interesting ways. And so if you have to understand kind of literature in India or politics in India, you need to understand what region does. So I thought, you know what, I'll step into this debate and have a think about how region as a category functions. The example of Orissa particularly is useful in this because it was the first linguistically organized region within India. It was formed in 1936, precisely at a time where Indian nationalism, the movement for Indian nationalism was becoming was settling into its kind of mass-based anti-colonial project that it became. So the period where the linguistic movement for the formation of Orissa took place in the late 19th to the early 20th century was also the period where Indian nationalism was becoming the thing that we recognize it as a kind of a big mass-based anti-colonial movement. So what I wanted to think about is how this parallel growth of regionalism and nationalism worked together, and how did these movements kind of reconcile with each other in such a way that both could exist together. So that was the PhD defense, PhD kind of question. Now, at my defense, which was a very pleasant experience, Simona Sani, who has also written this wonderful book called Modernity of Sanskrit, asked a very provocative question, as she often does. And she said, what is the authority of language in all of this? And I found that very hard because I did not like working on language. I wrote one chapter on language and I never wanted to go back to it. And I thought we are done. This is a book about politics and concepts, not about language. So I went away and had a big, long think about it and spent the next 2 or 3 years thinking about the authority of language in India. Why does language have this salient kind of control over the way people think about their identities and think about their relationship with the nation, but with their own communities. So this was the first provocation. So suddenly now I wasn't just thinking about region as a category, I was thinking about linguistic region as a category. And why was it so important in the nationalist movement? Why wasn't it something that was going to kind of disrupt and break apart the Indian nation as such, right? Provocation 1. I go about, do quite a lot of research around this question, start getting involved in language scholarship, and I search for tools to crack this nut. So how do I do it? And found, as many people do, some inspiration in Derrida. And he has this little book called Monolingualism of the Other, which starts with a very, very provocative sentence. And he says, I have but one language, and yet that language is not mine. Which is a wonderful, wonderful sentence. It does a number of things, that sentence, but to me, when I was thinking about it, I realized, oh, actually, that's English. For me, that is English. But also, and that's precisely what he meant. He was talking about French, and I know we're on the same page, me and Derrida on that one. But what he was trying to do with that is trying to destabilize the relationship between the self and language. This idea of owning language, having language, language being yours, and language having you, that relationship between language and the self, that this isn't actually as simple as we think it is. If you're a colonized subject, then you have a language and yet it is not yours. But can that apply to other places? Can we actually come to this idea of how language, citizenship, nation, etc. work without a kind of assumption of a natural relationship between the self and the language? Right. So that helped as a tool to really think about how do I historicize the linguistic region in a kind of non-positivist way, without assuming that, we've always been a region and people have spoken this language, they have a sense of place, etc. Is there a kind of making? And in particular, how is it that we arrive at this moment where we are all monolingual subjects, particularly in India, but also elsewhere? By the early 20th century, when, for instance, Woodrow Wilson is talking about self-determination, he's also talking about self-determination through language. He actually mentions that. So the self that is staked in self-determination is already a languaged subject. So in India, when does this happen? How does it happen? Especially given the fact that India doesn't, in fact, have any kind of native words for the idea of the mother tongue. So you don't really have language in quite the same way. So there are kind of scholars who have looked at pre-colonial language use and have kind of shown how, in a single day, a person could be using 4 or 5 languages, right? They could be speaking to their mother in Telugu, their neighbor in Tamil, their priest in Sanskrit, and then going off and paying their taxes in Persian. So there was a way in which people were monolingual, they were multilingual, they had certain kind of emotive relationships with certain languages, but they didn't see themselves as monolingual subjects. So when does this happen? If we do track that history, what does it tell us about the Indian nation, about linguistic nationalism, about Indian citizenship, and about kind of the operations of power in this making of the set of monolingual subjects who will then become one nation. So that's what the book is trying to get at. And by getting at that, I arrive at some histories of power that kind of really become central to this question of how language is both powerful and powerless in India through the term vernacular. But I can talk about that a bit more as we go on.
Thank you so much for that, Preeti. That is wonderful. And I mean, it's great to be back in conversation with you after all these years. I remember in the old social sciences tower, the long conversations that we'd have. So it's nice to be chatting again. And it was, reading your book, which again, after these years, was also great. I mean, the changes from the dissertation were just amazing, right? It's just so much, it's fantastic. And I just wanted to start with this. I mean, I loved your point about, none of us being monolingual subjects, especially in India, which is very, very common. I mean, one of the things that always, when I came to the US, I think one of the things that always struck me is people would ask me, how do you pronounce your name, right? Yeah. And it struck me because, in a sense, that question comes from a monophonic world. Yeah. Because in India, where people speak 4 or 5 languages, you're used to your name being said in 10 different ways. Yes. So you just, it's very striking. Yeah. And what you've done in this book is try and look at how a kind of multilingual world is trying to be imagined as a nation. And you begin with this, by stressing how central languages and region is to India, because there's this, you begin with the national anthem, and I'll just read out what you read from the national anthem, which goes, "Thou art the ruler of the minds of all people, dispenser of India's destiny. Thy name rouses the hearts of Punjab, Sindhu, Gujarat, and Maratha, of the Dravida, Utkala, and Bengal. It echoes in the hills of Vindhyas and Himalayas, mingles in the music of the Yamuna and Ganga." Now, I suppose what you're stressing is that, look, regions and languages are absolutely central to the imagining of India. And then you go on in the book to make this wonderful twofold argument, right? On the one hand, you say that, as you say, people expected at that time that all these regional identities, all these linguistic identities would come in the way of national unity, right? Yeah. Instead, something quite different happened. What happened was really that it actually strengthened national unity. And at the same time, within each region, this is the other wonderful argument you make, that there was a certain kind of way in which people who did not fit into the dominant language, once you had a language like Gujarati or Maharashtra, or Marathi, became secondary citizens in that state, right? So in a sense, this is also about the creation of monolingual societies, right? I wondered whether you could talk a bit more about these two arguments that you bring together so very well, and just elaborate, just unpack those for us.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yes, so I think this is, maybe I'll start with showing you a map. I have gotten permission to share screen. Partly the reason I want to show you a map is to kind of show how this distinction works. So this is 1903, India in 1903, and this is kind of pre-independence. And as you can see, there are these big, massive chunks of land that are kind of presidency provinces. So you have kind of Kashmir here, so Punjab, which is now half Pakistan, but the ones that we want to look at are kind of Bombay presidency here, Madras presidency here, and Bengal, and then Eastern Bengal and Assam. And that changes, that map radically changes by the time we get to 1956. And what you have here, and this process is not over yet. It's a process that kind of will continue for the next about 20 years from then on. You have a complete linguistic reorganization of India that is happening here. So you have Orissa, which has been formed out of this Bengal presidency. You have Bihar, you have West Bengal, and then you have Andhra Pradesh, which is now 2 provinces, in fact. And then you have the Madras province, which then becomes kind of Tamil Nadu. So what I want to do, the reason I want to show this map is to show how neat this definition and linguistic kind of mapping. The diversity of India is not being denied here, but this diversity is a diversity of language that almost becomes linguistic difference in that period becomes the most acceptable register of difference in India. So India's diversity becomes spoken through this linguistic diversity. And what is elided here is diversity of caste, of religion, of class, or gender. Particularly if you think about religion, for instance, it's very easy to talk about kind of lack of diversity, to talk about kind of uniformity in places like Bengal, for instance, by saying that actually the Bengali Muslim brother and the Bengali Hindu brother have a lot more in common with each other than their religious difference would tell us anything about their kind of proper difference. So what's happening there is that language then gets staked as this kind of acceptable, comfortable register of difference. Now, this can only happen through a certain idea of monolingual subjecthood that we've talked about. But this process of producing an Orissa where everybody speaks Oriya is also about hiding away those who do not speak Oriya, right? So Orissa that is formed in 1936, a quarter of that population of that Oriya speaking Orissa is Adivasi. They do not speak Oriya. And if they do speak Oriya, they speak Oriya precisely in the same way that I speak English or Derrida speaks French, right? It's a language of their colonizer. They have but one language and it is not theirs. So what is happening here is a certain kind of making linguistic difference the most acceptable form of kind of difference in India, and hence enabling a definition of India that can live with its unity in diversity, right? And not feel like they're going to get unraveled. But at the same time, in the making of that, the kind of rendering invisible these kind of categories of people who don't speak these majority languages. And a lot of this happens for us to kind of unravel how these two ways of being, these two kind of dominant threads of nationalism are occurring, is to think through the question of how language works. What is the authority of language in all of that? Why is language less scary to the Indian nationalists than religious difference or caste difference, etc.? And at the same time, why is language something that we are able to use as a identifier, right? And the reason we can do that is because, and I argue this in the book, is that language becomes both powerless and powerful at the same time in colonial and then post-colonial India. And for me to be able to make that argument, I kind of arrive at the term vernacular, to think through the term vernacular, because I think it is in that term vernacular that a lot of this kind of eliding of power but holding on to power happens. And part of this has to do with where the term itself comes from. And it is a term that is, again, quite foreign to India. The only term that you can find that is kind of similar to, that kind of denotes the same languages in the pre-colonial period would be Desi, or language of place. Whereas vernacular is a much more heavy word and it's carrying a lot of different kinds of weight. Now, one of the things it's carrying, according to Ranajit Guha, a founding member of the Subaltern Studies Collective, is the idea of enslavement, that vernacular carries this idea of enslavement because it comes from the term varna. And therefore, according to Guha, it is the language of the slave, it is the language of the oppressed, and in speaking it, in recognizing it, in enabling it to be used in public space, you are actually giving voice to the oppressed. That is the idea of vernacular as powerless. But at the same time, there is another kind of career of the vernacular, particularly in the European modern world, but then that is taken over by kind of colonized India and post-colonial India. And this career of the vernacular is about how vernacular, precisely because it's the language of the enslaved or language of the oppressed or language of the people, the common tongue, it is also the language through which governance should happen. And this comes from a movement particularly in England in the late 18th century, where there's a kind of argument about how people should be governed by their language, but more importantly, people should be governed by simple language, that there's a way in which using language which nobody understands produces a certain kind of autocracy and bad rule. In proper liberal rule, you should use language that people understand. So two things are happening here. There is a language that is spoken by the people who are oppressed, and it is their language, it is their viscerally connected language, but it's also the language through which proper liberal rule should happen. So in imagining a kind of democratic citizen subject and a democratic state that needs to deal with the citizen subject, you need to use the language of the people. So what this is doing is it's taking what is considered a powerless language and making it the language of command, the language of rule, the language of institutional power. And that is how these kind of two ideas of the vernacular function in India. So therefore, while it's being made the language of rule and the language of power, etc., it is becoming this, it's enabling this neat definition of India into linguistic zones. But at the same time, in talking about it as the language of oppressed, it is also in kind of engendering a certain kind of radical politics. The problem with all of this is that these are and have been historically the language of the powerful, the language of the powerful in local areas. So in Orissa, for instance, Oriya is the language of caste Hindus, upper caste Hindus. It is not the language of the 25% of Adivasis. But that kind of exclusion of the Adivasi is kind of written out when you start thinking of it as a language that is powerless and a language of command. And it is through this kind of process that we get to a way of defining India linguistically that is both including the Adivasi, and I will talk about that a little bit more later, how the Adivasi is made kind of both visible and invisible in this process, but it's also excluding it, that community.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. I mean, I'm glad you touched on that, and I'm also, you have this lovely phrase in your book, the repressive power of the vernacular, right? Which actually captures some of what you're trying to say, and I think which we'll get back to, I'm sure. I wondered whether you could speak a bit also about, one of the things that you're doing in the book is tracing how the relation between Indian nationalism and quote unquote regional nationalism, right, changes over the decades from the late 19th century to the 20th. I mean, could you tell us a bit more about these changes? I mean, for example, you talk about the rise of an Odia political subject, right? What do you mean by that? And
Thank you. So this is, I think, at the core of the book is this history of the shift. And it happens because early Indian nationalism does not want to talk about difference. They are aggressively avoiding difference. So every constitution of the Indian National Congress from 1885 up to kind of 1915 is saying we don't talk about social and cultural issues. Women don't exist, caste doesn't exist. We're just going to talk about our political interests. And what this means is that they're not also talking about linguistic politics. Whereas in regions across India, not just in Orissa, but in Orissa, in Andhra Pradesh, in Tamil Nadu, in Maharashtra, and across the country, there is a move towards thinking about community through language. And this happens precisely because the colonial state starts seeing its subjects as languaged, because of the process I was talking about earlier, that there's this desire to rule through the language of the people, because that is seen as proper liberal rule. And in the kind of colonial papers, there's no justification for it. It's almost an a priori truth. So they change the language of rule in 1827 from Persian to Hindu, Hindustani, Oriya, and Bengali, and they don't explain themselves. They're like, this is proper rule. And they send out kind of memos across the Bengal presidency and ask people for responses. And when people respond saying, this is clunky, why would we do that? This makes no sense. They just don't take into account. So it is an a priori to rule through the language of the people. So what that produces is, by the late 19th century, is a certain kind of regional politics, which is about working with the state to have more power for particular language groups. And this is the root of all these linguistic regional movements that are happening across across 19th century India. Now, so there's this regional linguistic movements that are rising, but Indian nationalism does not want to talk about any of it. It's like, la, 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 it's not existing. And then we get to this moment in, I mean, there's a lot of la, la, la. Sorry, no, I didn't mean myself laugh. We get to 1918-1919, where the Indian nationalists have been promised some greater degree of franchise, and big promises, right? And the Government of India Act of 1919 comes out, which is supposed to promise people franchise. And at the center of that argument is this one rather painful thing. And that is, and it's a very colonial argument, and that's that the Indian National Congress is full of these posh English-speaking people, and they do not represent the masses, the peasant. Not anyone, definitely not the Adivasi, but the peasant. They don't represent them. And if we give more franchise to Indians, then it will put these people in power, and then the peasant will not be protected from exploitation from these people in power. So reducing the amount of franchise promised was a way to protect the Indian peasant from these upper class Indians who were English speaking. So fundamentally what they were saying is that the Indian National Congress did not represent the Indian masses. Mm-hmm. And one of the arguments there was around the question of language, because you don't speak that language. And what this produces within the Indian National Congress is the final realization that actually we need to do something about it. We need to speak to the masses in their language. And there are a number of speeches in that moment that happen in the kind of Congress Center about it. And this leads to a kind of linguistic reorganization of the Indian National Congress itself. And it leads to the first moment where Gandhi starts talking about language, regional languages, and why we need to talk about them. And I will talk about them later if there's time for that. But one of the things the Indian National Congress does is that it reimagines its local organization and starts setting up regional Congress committees based on linguistic lines. So they don't follow the existing boundaries of provinces in India. They actually make up new boundaries of linguistic provinces, which don't exist, they only exist in the Congress local committees. And that is the first moment when the Indian National Congress recognizes Indian languages. Now, what we can see in this entire arc from the Indian National Congress's perspective is that they are actually beginning to realize that if we want the masses to be political, we need to speak to them in their language, which is copying the kind of 19th century colonial idea that we need to rule in people's own languages. Mm-hmm. What this is doing on the other side, on the Orissa side, is that there's a kind of reluctance to be, just like the Indian National Congress is political only and not social and cultural, The Orissa side wants to be social, cultural only and not political, because they feel as though only the colonial state will give them their linguistic rights. The Congress is not involved. It's not going to help us. And in this period, there's a parallel move where they begin to realize actually the International Congress will give linguistic rights. And this is when regions become politicized into nations. But so the way Orissa enters into the nation, therefore, is through the imagination of a monolingual political subject who can only be ruled, only be politicized through the idea of this kind of identity as a monolingual subject. So in that very moment when Indian masses are being politicized into political citizen subjects, that citizen subject is already imagined as a linguistically defined subject. So that's the Odia political subject that's rising in that moment.
Thank you. That was great. And, and one of the things I really enjoyed about reading the book was also the way you foregrounded, and in a sense, it is already there in your dissertation, but you've built it up so much more now and so well. The role of Gandhi and the national debates about, trying to think of what does it mean to have a multilingual nation, and I thought that was beautifully done. But obviously, as you're stressing also, there are people that are left out in the process, right? And especially in the case of Odisha, which is, I believe, around 22% Adivasi.
Yeah, it kind of fluctuates.
Yeah, so, that's a huge chunk of the population.
Yes. Yeah.
And if it's 22% Adivasi now, I'm sure it was closer to 30 or 40% Adivasi then, right?
Yeah. It was, 26, there wasn't, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. So could you, I'd love to hear a bit more about the role of how Adivasis were kind of,
Yeah, thank you. That's,
Oh, and sorry, I should have, maybe you could also tell us, tell the rest of us who Adivasis are, because that's not necessarily a...
Okay, so Adivasis are, they are considered it's very dangerous to say any positive statements. It's a very complex category. So one of the simplest ways of understanding the Adivasi communities would be to say they are the kind of indigenous peoples of India. And they were in the colonial period defined as scheduled tribes. So they were often kind of in particular communities. The Orissa has 26 Adivasi communities, and they are kind of considered as scheduled tribes. So they were listed in the colonial archive as people who needed to be protected by the state from these kind of more aggressive coastal people. The term Adivasi is the preferred term. Often people don't use the term tribal anymore. But if for us to recognize what that idea is, I think tribal is the closest term in terms of thinking about how these communities work. They were not often part of the kind of ruling class. However, in Orissa, it's slightly different because they were they were intrinsically involved in structures of rule and ritual in Orissa, both religious ritual, but also sovereign ritual in king princely states, etc., where they kind of gave people political authority by accepting the rule. So the position of Adivasi in Orissa's imagination of itself is really interesting, and it keeps shifting over time. So if we start at the kind of first moment of Oriya nationalist movement, it all starts because somebody says Oriya is a dialect of Bengali and it's not a real language on its own. We need to get rid of Oriya from official language use and school use, and we should just use Bengali. And this starts a kind of big movement and people get really upset. And at the core of this movement is a kind of philological argument. And this is not proper philology in any way, shape, or form. It is kind of very political philology, where people who are amateur philologists are going around and showing through texts how Oriya looks exactly like Bengali. And then the counter argument is, no, Oriya does not look exactly like Bengali through these other texts. So it's just these fight. The eventual resolution of that fight happens in the 1860s and 70s, where the Oriya side argues, and this is an argument that stays consistent up to for the next 50 years, and it is that So one of the reasons Oriya and Bengali are seen as the same is that they belong to the same linguistic language family, which is the Indo-European language. Now, this is because they both draw from roots from Sanskrit and Prakrit, which are ancient languages. And so the problem is that it's very hard to find distinctions between these two languages because they're right next to each other. The Oriya claim is that Oriya is distinct from Bengali precisely because of the Adivasi presence in Orissa, precisely because it draws from Adivasi languages and words and ways of thinking. And that's what makes it a separate language. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, the kind of originary moment of this is that we are an Adivasi speaking language people. And in that way, they are able to kind of include the Adivasis within the Oriya community. And in that conversation, there are a number of kind of important terms that emerge. One is this idea of a language of side by side, that we have kind of a shared everyday life with the Adivasis. They feel more comfortable with us. It's not a narrative of trusteeship as is made in other places, other parts of India. It's more that there's a kind of sharing of time and space with them and sharing of important ritual culture with them. And this is how Adivasis are incorporated into the kind of Oriya community. Now, this comes to a head by the 1912s and in the kind of just before Orissa is formed, because there's one big section of Orissa which people find, the Oriyas and the Telugus, which is the province below them, are fighting over. And this is the majority Adivasi part of the province. So are they Oriya speaking or are they Telugu speaking? Who gets to get Ganjam, which is the province? And this is when, again, they go back to this 1866 argument and says, we have this kind of shared everyday life with them. They are part of our ritual culture. They are part of the Jagannath cult. The Jagannath cult, which is a kind of big religious establishment in coastal Orissa, one of the four major provinces, pilgrimage spots in India, also is the place where Adivasis are welcome and they are included. And because they're not included, allowed into the temple, the god himself comes out to meet the Adivasis once a year in the Jagannath kind of festival of Rath Yatra, right? So there are all these arguments that are being made about inclusion, and these arguments are being made about inclusion in very institutional spaces. So in spaces where do we retain language, Oriya as a language of instruction in schools and in government offices, or do we kind of claim this space as Oriya and put it in our region when boundaries are being drawn? So in this process, what is happening is Adivasis are being made very visible as part of the Oriya community. But once Orissa is drawn, they are just part of this culture and they're not seen. Once you see that final map of India in 1956, all you see is Orissa, the Oriya speaking land of Orissa. What you don't see is this quarter of a population that is both included, but also included as second-class citizens. They are not the Oriyas that the state is thinking about when they're thinking about kind of who are the Oriyas as such. So that's kind of why I talk about the invisibility of the minorities, how Adivasi becomes the invisible minority.
That's fantastic. Yeah. You know, something similar, as you know, my first book was about Adivasis, and something similar happens in the region that I was studying, because Dangs is between Gujarat and Maharashtra. And when the linguistic states are formed, the question is, you know, whether Dang should be part of Gujarat or Maharashtra. And the Gandhians play a big role in claiming that actually Gujarat, Dangs should be part of Maharashtra. And of course, it's very interesting how this works also in the example you gave, right? How caste is very much at work, because, you know, Jagannath cannot actually, they cannot actually go in to meet Jagannath, right? So there's an exclusion, right? But at the same time, Jagannath goes out to meet them. And so there's an inclusion, you know, despite the exclusion. That sounds very bad, but there's an exclusionary inclusion, so to speak. Right, and which is so characteristic of the logic of caste.
Right? Absolutely.
And you know, with all the violence that it involves, right? But so I'm very, that point about the invisible minority was very good, and I loved it. I just want, there are many other questions I have, but I'll stick to one more because I know there are other questions that others will have, which is that, we are now in a different moment in India's history, which is the moment when Hindu nationalism has come to be dominant in a way that it was not. Certainly not, it was only a threat when you were writing your dissertation. And I suppose one question I have is, does the rise of Hindu nationalism change in any way the way you would perceive things today?
Thank you. I love that question. Partly because, so I think that the Hindu nationalist threat kind of sat at the back of my mind when I was thinking particularly around this question of Jagannath and sacred territory, and how this place is kind of almost by some sort of slave hand being made into a Hindu space. It is Hindu land.
Yes, exactly.
And how is that happening? So it was at the back of my mind because I wanted to tell this story, but in my eternal optimism, I also didn't want to date the book by talking about Hindutva, because I thought at some point they would die out. Clearly that was not going to happen. But I think that's this easy question answer. But the more important question was, I wanted to tell the story to actually track precisely the kinds of arguments that can be used by Hindutva to claim Orissa as a Hindu space. That's what the story, the book is tracking. And in that way, it probably wouldn't change. But what would change is what is happening now with, and I don't know how to think this, I'm very confused at the moment, because what's happening now is Hindutva is obviously rising in Orissa, for instance, and I've got my numbers here because I thought I'll do the research here. So in 1992, the BJP won 2 seats in Orissa. So this was immediately after the Babri Masjid, and it was just the rise of it. And obviously, as you said, when I started the dissertation, the BJP was nowhere in power in Orissa. In the 2019 election, which is the last regional election, the BJP won 32% of the vote. And that's just 23 seats. So when you look at the number of seats it's won 23 seats versus 112 seats by the regional political party. But when you look at the percentage of vote, they won 32%, whereas the regional political party, BJD, won 44%. So which means that, yes, the BJD won 112 seats, but they were very, very close one, right? They were very closely fought, which means the BJP is catching up very, very fast. Now, this is happening across India, and what it's doing is that it's pushing regional political parties into out-Hindutvaing Hindutva, right? So I recently heard a paper on Bengal, and it was talking about how Mamata Banerjee is using certain kind of Hindu myths in her politics, and it looks very like Hindutva, and it walks and quacks like Hindutva, but at the same time it's not, because it's Mamata Banerjee saying all these things. So it's the same thing with, so how would BJD out Hindutva? It would use precisely the structures of thought that the book is talking about, where you are taking a place that is just a place and turning it into the sacred geography of Hinduism, right? So that process, it is useful to track, and it's important to think about how that normative way of thinking about Orissa is coming about. What has confused me, however, is the BJP and the Indian National Congress's push towards trying to get the Adivasi vote. So very, very recently, a month ago, Modi said A is for Adivasi. And they are particularly vying for the Oriya Adivasi vote. And they are doing this through kind of making an Oriya Adivasi woman the president, but they're also doing it through kind of very aggressive political lobbying in Orissa. So the question there becomes, what does the Adivasi as the category do in that new kind of politics? And what is the kind of, what's the economics of it? I mean, this is all ideas, identity, blah, 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 is great, but what's the economics of it? Because there's a lot of Adivasi activism that's fighting against corporate interests in Orissa around mining and steel industry, etc. Now, what would the BJP do with that? Because they're not actually going to retract that kind of corporatization of the Oriya forests. So I don't know. I don't have an answer. And I think if this particular moment had happened when I was writing the book, I think it would look different a little bit.
Well, thank you so much, Priti and Ajay. And I'm going to start reading questions that will be coming into the chat. We have one. I just want to sort of throw out more of a comment than a question, but that one of the things that really intrigued me as I was reading the book was precisely this dynamic you were talking about a sort of exclusive inclusion, because the book itself is so rich in the kind of unique path of India from colonialism to a certain kind of nation state. But those dynamics of this kind of exclusive inclusion also resonate for me as a Latin Americanist, that with independence from Spain, that there are sort of claims from Creole elites to an identity that's different from Europe because, oh, we have all these, incorporating indigeneity or African descent people, depending on the place. But then once they make that move, it delegitimizes any claims to autonomy from those minority groups. So I found that very fascinating, that despite the real differences between the context, that this sort of dynamic really resonated. But I'm going to go ahead and read a question from the chat from Siddharthan, who says, what have been some of the key characteristics of the politics between Oriya and Hindi within the Indian Union? I say this as someone who knows more about Tamil Nadu, where there have been many anti-Hindi protests, as I'm sure you're aware.
Thank you for that question. There's less of a kind of fight with Hindi than it's actually almost none. There isn't a kind of cohesive critique of Hindi as a kind of aggressive nationalizing language in Orissa as such. So that's the kind of simple answer. Obviously, with Tamil Nadu, there's a much more aggressive anti-Hindi protest, and some of that has to do with kind of the fact that the South is from an entirely different linguistic root. So there is a way in which Hindi is seen as a sister language. So when the kind of in 1918, when they're arguing for kind of separate regional linguistic franchise, the argument within Orissa is that we need to kind of make sure that the Bengalis and the Hindi speakers, etc., who are sister languages, don't encroach upon Oriya rights. And that is how it is seen going forward. So in some ways, a lot of the arguments through time in Orissa, but also around kind of Indo-European languages in the center with kind of Gandhi, etc., sees these languages as a collection of sisters rather than as languages that are kind of at war with each other. It is very hard to make that kind of argument about the Dravidian languages versus the Indo-European languages, and that's where that fight comes. But Hindi is not seen as a sort of aggressive language. The fight is with Bengali, as Ajay just said to me, because Bengali is seen as a kind of almost like a colonizing language. It's trying to encroach upon the space of Oriya. So in some ways, Hindi is not the enemy. It's really Bengali that is the enemy in this kind of politics.
Are there other questions that people from the audience want to put into the chat? Maybe in the meantime, and this is kind of an unfair question, but I brought up the way that the case that you were so beautifully developing resonated for me in a small way with what I know about Latin American nation formation. As you've gone out, and I don't know, how broad your teaching is, or the sort of conversations you have with other scholars who think about sort of decolonization and nation formation in parts of the world where there is a lot of multilingualism. Are you seeing other cases that where you see similar dynamics to India, or do you really see, the process unfolds so differently in different parts of the world with decolonization?
Thank you for that. I mean, before I answer that question, I do want to say when I was writing those, the tribal chapters, I was talking about the Adivasi figure. One of my closest friends then, who has now moved back to Latin America, was an anthropologist who worked with the Quechua people. And we were having this very, very similar conversations. Just like, oh, this is exactly what is happening there. So now, I think globally there is, in most decolonizing countries, there is kind of anxiety about multilingualism. I can't really speak to whether there are exactly the same kind of inclusion-exclusion dynamics that are happening, but what is happening a lot, and I work on this in a kind of different space, is there is this idea that a nation has to be monolingual. There's one single language. And it's a kind of Herderian notion of what a nation is. And a lot of post-colonial nations, whether it's Singapore or South Africa with its 11 languages, or Singapore with its 3 languages, or even the US with Spanish, have to contend with this idea that how do we see our multilingualism not as a failure? Because that's what it feels like. It's a failure. It's almost a dangerous corruption that needs to somehow be redefined, and that the paths to that kind of to the resolution of that is very different, very specific to different spaces. But that's kind of all I can say.
Well, now we have a lot of questions coming in. Maybe start with a couple of the more historical ones and then move to some of the ones that sort of think about the historical impact in India today. But Emily asks, I wonder if you could speak a little to the way that Orissa functioned as a first linguistic state in the midst of the post-independence linguistic states movements, especially in the Andhra movement with regard to class and caste differences. And maybe I'll just throw a second one in there and you can think about, how you want to respond to the two. Harlan asks, what is the role of vernaculars in the translation of Hindu scriptures and nationalism? So a couple questions there about language.
Thank you. So I don't, okay, great. So Orissa becomes the first linguistically organized province, but it is running quite closely in parallel to the Andhra movement, which is also kind of starts around the same time. What is striking about Orissa in some ways, particularly with regard to caste, is that caste is not explicitly mentioned. It's not explicitly discussed. As Ajay Penn pointed out with the temple entry issue, that it is there. It is foundational. And a lot of the kind of people who lead the Oriya movement are upper caste. And there's a certain kind of exclusion of lower caste narratives around community, etc., that happen in literary collectives, etc., at the same time. But language is not seen, not kind of very explicitly talked about as a kind of upper caste object. In comparison, if we look particularly at Maharashtra and Marathi is talked about as the people who are involved in thinking about Marathi as a modern language and as a language of command, etc., are Brahmins. And there's a very close kind of alignment between Brahmin politics in Maharashtra and linguistic politics in Maharashtra. The situation in Andhra, I'm blanking out now, so I don't have an answer to it, other than the fact that class does matter there, but it's a little bit more complex, partly because there it is seen as a language of the popular. It's a language of the people, and it is, and that kind of the popular politics becomes what drives it. So if you think about Orissa and Maharashtra as these kind of very genteel upper class movements that are just talking through petitions, etc., what is happening in places like Andhra Pradesh and later in Tamil Nadu is that it becomes a movement of the street. It becomes a popular movement of the street, and where people are willing to die for this language. So Lisa Mitchell writes about, her point of departure is precisely this: why are people willing to die for Telugu? Why are they willing to self-immolate themselves publicly for Telugu? And there, in some ways, I think language is dismantling narratives of caste and class in a way that Orissa and Maharashtra are actually building upon narratives of class and caste. Does that answer your question, Emily? Sorry, my answer is also a bit of a mashup.
And do you want to take the question about
Yeah.
the role of vernaculars and?
Yeah. Harlan, thanks for that as well. So there's a really interesting moment in kind of what would be medieval in India, but early modern in the rest of the world, because we do time differently, in kind of the 15th and 16th, 17th centuries, where a lot of kind of central Indian texts, particularly the epics, narrative epics that were written in Sanskrit, are translated into vernaculars across India. And it's not just happening in Orissa, it's happening in various places. So the first kind of vernacular translations of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana happened precisely in this period. So the Oriya Mahabharata is translated by Sarala Das in the kind of 1550s. And this is about making accessible a certain kind of popular religiosity. So what is not being translated is proper scriptures. What's being translated are the epics, these kind of narratives of community and belief and faith. And this is tied into a moment where there is almost a kind of, the closest we would come to it in the West is a kind of the Reformation, this kind of unpacking of Brahmin dominance of religion by moving towards a more kind of accessible form of religiosity. It's called the Bhakti movement, and part of the Bhakti movement meant that a lot of these kind of religious narratives of collective experience were being translated into the vernaculars. And in some ways that also forms the moment where, at least in the Northern Indian vernaculars, where vernacular literature takes off in a big way from then on, because it's then seen, once you've translated a kind of big scriptural, not scriptural, but big epic text, which was in Sanskrit, it's seen as a language that can carry high literature, high culture. It gets a lot of patronage from various kings, etc., and that kind of drives the vernacular millennium, as Sheldon Pollock calls it, from that moment on. Not answer.
We have just a couple minutes left, and so I don't know if you can address these or not, but we had a couple questions that are more about the contemporary resonances. Michael asked, how do young people in India influence this debate on language? What languages are they speaking? And Paulette brings in the case of social media. So, you know, the whole new forum for language debates or use.
I think with language in India, I think class matters a lot. And I think it's very, if we were to say young people have moved away from regional languages, we were then talking about very, very upper class young people. We're not talking about the kind of majority of young people who still continue to use these languages. They're doing really interesting things with the new literatures are emerging. A lot of Dalit literature, for instance, is actually in vernacular languages. It's even though it's kind of taking on Hindi and other vehicular languages, it's also using vernacular languages, but there's a kind of critique of the vernacular tongue, particularly in Dalit literature. Maybe I want to just talk about Dalit literature for a second, where they feel that vernacular languages are precisely what I think they are, and precisely what Ambedkar thought they were going to be, languages of command used by the upper caste elites. And for Dalit politics, Dalit is kind of the untouchable, more commonly known as untouchable politics, people who are outside of the caste system that are fighting the caste oppression. Using these languages feels like participating in that oppression. So they use English as a critique of this kind of language of command idea of these vernacular languages. So in that community, there's a very interesting shift. However, in most of India, these languages are still very widely used. There's so much cinema and music that supports them. So one can't actually argue that they're moving away from it. Social media, if anything, has actually built this even further.
Great, thank you so much. I want to thank Priti and Ajay for such a fascinating discussion. Thank the audience for coming and posing your questions. I want to invite you to the next book club, which will be January 25th, also at the noontime hour, since we have a guest also coming in from across the Atlantic. Ruth Karras and Catherine Pierpont will discuss their 4th edition of Sexuality in Medieval Europe, so that you'll receive information about that. You'll receive a link to the recording of today's session if you want to go back to it. Clayton, I think we'll put in the chat a link if you're inspired to donate to the history department and support our current graduate students who will go on and be future speakers at the book club as their dissertations evolve into even more interesting books, as Ajay has shown us with Priti's transformation into her book project. So that closes our official book club, but we will stay online here for a few more minutes if you want to unmute and just say hi to Priti or Ajay while you have them here on the Zoom. So thank you very much.